Okay, Samirajan, we are live on YouTube and the recording has started. We have 26 attendees now. We can get going.
Thank you very much to everyone who's joining us today. I'll give a brief introduction to the webinar, and then we will start with a narrative and then go on to our panelists. So welcome to everyone. This is our sixth session in a 10-part series on the abolition of the death penalty. This is a virtual panel discussion series that tackles the complex question of the death penalty with a view to its abolition in retentionist states, particularly in the contemporary context of the Middle East, in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. The panel series will provide in-depth discussions on the death penalty from diverse legal, philosophical, sociological, psychological, and political perspectives. As I mentioned, this is the sixth session in a 10-part series, and our focus today is on war and capital punishment. In this session, capital punishment will be examined in both global and regional contexts with a focus on times of armed conflict. We will explore how war increases violations of the right to life and poses a serious challenge to the abolitionist discourse. War will be discussed as a setting in which the state's use of lethal force is readily justified, expanded, and normalized. The death penalty in its various forms is often imposed on vague grounds, such as national security, espionage, sedition, and terrorism. During periods of foreign aggression, these justifications become especially convenient for the continued use of capital punishment. The session will shed light on ideas and ways to hold aggressors and human rights violators accountable in such contexts for protecting human life, particularly in times of war. Our panelists for today are Alex Neve, Senior Fellow, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, Mahmoud Amiri Moghaddam from Iran Human Rights Organization in Norway, and Omid Milani, a fellow at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. I will give more extensive bios of our panelists prior to them speaking. But before we begin with our panelists, we have a narrative to open up this session, and it will be presented by Abbas Azadian. Abbas is a psychiatrist who received their medical degree from the University of Ottawa and specializes in psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Their professional work has been particularly focused on providing psychological support and treatment to survivors of war and torture. Since arriving in Canada, they have made significant contributions through their collaboration with various organizations, including the Iranian community and the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. What makes their perspective especially profound is the way they connect their professional work with their personal experience. In the 1980s, while studying dentistry at Ferdowsi University of Mashhad, they were imprisoned for 2 years and endured torture during that time. This deeply personal experience has shaped their career path and turned them into one of the most impactful voices in the field of mental health support for survivors of political violence. Thank you, Abbas, so much for joining us today. The microphone is yours.
Thank you, Samira. I would like to thank you and also the panelists. I also like to thank everybody who is watching and listening to this program. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Just one correction, I studied medicine at the University of Toronto. I did my undergrad at the University of Ottawa. Now, in terms of personal experiences, I really went through years of war, censorship, and trauma when I lived in Iran. And what I can say, to start my talk, what I can say is that war can make suppression of opposition easier. And in particular, it makes the use of capital punishment much easier. And the reason is that war does not just silence people. It replaces discussion, talk, and dissent with fear, nationalism, and demand for absolute unity. When you ask me to talk today I was flooded with past experiences. I remembered my jail time. I remembered how I was arrested. I remembered my hearing, and all of those things came back to me. And they all happened in the context of Iran-Iraq war that started in 1980. So when we had the revolution, there was an explosion of discussion, of opportunities, of free speech, of journalists talking, of students expressing themselves. Leftists, Islamists, feminists, you just name it. Everybody could talk to. People had meetings, art, all different forms of art. And then we had the war. And when the war started, all of that was replaced with suppression. Tens of thousands of students and teachers, university professors were expelled from universities. Many thousands of people were arrested, and I was one of them. So that is the effect of war on our life. I remember when I was arrested, I was put in isolation. I was tortured initially, beaten up frequently, and then I was put in front of a judge without knowing that I was in front of the judge and without having access to a lawyer at that time. And in a 5-minute summary hearing, I was lucky enough just to get 5 years of jail time, plus another 5 years of extra just in case if I did something wrong and they could use the whole 10 years. I was lucky only to serve 2 years of that. But many people weren't as lucky. I had friends, I had one of my classmates was killed in that time. Many friends I had who were killed at that time and later on. So many people were killed. Some of them even without any hearing. Some of them were killed on the street. When they were arrested on the streets, they were killed right there. The capital punishment was carried out right on the street at that time. So I forget to bring the book. I have a list of people who were killed, and there are a few thousand names in the book that I have in my library. So we had the revolution, we had the opportunity to talk, express, and then we had the war started, and that gave the pretext for suppression of opposition because the war demanded absolute unity, and then they used that for capital punishment. Now, not only the start of Iran-Iraq war was used to arrest people and kill people, the end of it also was used to kill people. When the war ended, when Iran accepted the ceasefire, they cut off prisoners from outside world. They cut all the contacts they had with their families and friends and lawyers. And again, they were asked questions without knowing that they were in front of a judge, and that their responses to those questions can affect their life. And again, a few thousand people, activists, former people who were in jail, were killed. Even some of my friends were asked to go back in jail, and they were also killed. I was lucky. I left the country about 8-9 months before 1988 massacre. And let me tell you something. I got a letter a few months after I left the country. I was forced to leave the country. I got a letter that I can go back and study. Now, let me tell you that I was expelled from university 8 years earlier, and just 3 months after I left the country, and 4 or 5 months before the mass execution of 1988, I got a letter that I can go back to my studies. So fortunately, I didn't pay attention to that. Now, I don't know whether that was a trap to lure me back into the country, or if that was just a coincidence. I would never know. But yeah, that happened to me, and I'm happy that I didn't go back. Now, As I mentioned, many of my friends were killed in that mass execution. Now, let's fast forward to the current war between Iran and Israel. And for not only for me, but for more of my patients, memories flooded back again. Many of my patients had dissociation. Many of my patients had re-experiencing of what happened to them in jail. I have at least 300-400 prisoners, former prisoners as my patients. They had more nightmares. They had flashbacks of their jail time, of their torture. And even one of my patients was telling me on Friday, I was talking to her that she was walking with her son, and all of a sudden she heard the airplane in the air in Toronto, and she with her son ran for cover, and she told me that only after a couple of minutes she realized that, well, why am I doing this? I'm in the safety of Canada. I'm in the safety of Toronto. Why I'm so scared here? And the answer was flashback of trauma. Trauma never leaves us alone. It stays with us. It stays in our body. It stays in our memory. Unless there is justice, that may help us to overcome what happened to us, the trauma that happened to us. And that is why many of us believe that we cannot forget. Obviously, we cannot forget. And also, we cannot forgive. And this is not out of really hatred. It is out of need for justice. It is out of need for clarification why these atrocities happen. And I stop here, and I think what I said is not just for me and my experiences, but also the experience of many of my patients. Thank you for listening to me.
Seems like we lost Samira. Can you guys give me just one quick second to connect to her?
If we are live, somebody can take over and continue the discussion.
Yeah, you can continue till Samira we're here.
Well, I can go on and talk about again more about the experiences of my patient, because I mean last 4, 5, 6 weeks since the Iran-Israel war started, I have been flooded. Like I really the demand for my time has increased, like maybe even double. Patients call me often. They need urgent appointments, and mostly because they cannot sleep. They're thinking about what happened, all the bad memories, past memories of trauma, of torture, of arrest. All of them are flooding back and really bothering them during the day, during the night. They cannot concentrate. They cannot focus. They have crying episodes. They have depression. They have anxiety. And I mean, initially they don't know what is happening and why these things are happening. But when we start talking and we have a session together, it becomes very clear that all these experiences are related to trauma they had, what happened to them in jail. One of my patients who is even psychotic, the trauma she experienced was so bad that she has psychotic symptoms. She has re-experiencing in the form that she thinks some unclear forces are coming and even opening up her brain in the middle of the night in Toronto, operating on her brain, taking all her information out and then putting the skull back. And she tells me that they have sophisticated means to concealed what they have operated, what they have done on her. So many of my patients who were in jail and arrested and tortured, they are really experiencing many symptoms of depression, anxiety, and in particular post-traumatic stress disorder, because re-experiencing nightmares, these are all symptoms of post-traumatic disorder, and even dissociation, which is another condition that many people who are traumatized experience. So now I may be less affected myself, being a therapist, being a doctor, having gone through this process, having talked to so many patients, doing presentations, writing about these experiences. They all have helped me overcome my own anxiety and tension. So it affects me less, but even I have been affected. Like a few days ago, I had a dream that I was in jail, but I wasn't being harassed in jail. Actually, I was observing and even had 2-3 young people around me, and I was teaching them. So, I still see myself in similar situations, like being in jail again. But because of the work I have done on myself, I'm less affected. I don't get panic attacks, or I don't get dissociation or post-traumatic stress symptoms. But for many of my patients, unfortunately, these symptoms happen, and then they re-experience the trauma. So the war brings, and it doesn't have even to be a war that Iran is involved. I remember September 11, and there was no war on Iran in September 11. But again, many of my patients, they re-experienced their trauma of war because, that is what they observed, the killing, the bombings of the cities. And so even an event like September 11 brought a lot of trauma back to my patient. I remember I had a talk at Canadian Center for Victims of Torture just a couple of months after September 11, just highlighting this issue that something like that event, September 11, can cause a lot of trauma in a lot of people who are not directly involved, in September 11. They are not even directly affected by September 11, but their trauma comes back to haunt them. And that is the issue is the memory. The body keeps the score. There's a very important article written, and the title is "Body Keeps the Score." Van der Kolk is a very prominent European psychiatrist who has worked on this. Our body and our memory keep the score, keep the details of the memory alive inside us. And as I said, unless there is a sense of justice, we cannot really put everything aside. And really, I tell my patients, it's impossible to forget because it is part of us. How could we forget? But we can make sense of our experience if there is a sense of justice. And I saw that in Rwanda. Now, I'm sure if we are connected, I stop talking because I'm well over my time. But I had a trip to Rwanda, and I see that happening there. They talked about it, and there was a sense of justice. Many of the people I met there who experienced atrocities in the 80s when the Rwanda genocide happened.
Thank you, Dr. Azadian. Unfortunately, we lost Samira, and our first panelist is Alex Neve. Alex, floor is yours.
Always remember to unmute yourself. Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be able to spend some time together and reflect on a very important and troubling human rights topic. I wanted to begin with a very recent, very human reminder of the death penalty's toll. And this may initially seem slightly off topic from what we are addressing today, war and capital punishment. But in fact, it is not. It is directly on point, so bear with me for a moment. I know that many friends and colleagues on today's webinar will be tragically aware of the fact that yesterday, 2 political prisoners were executed in Iran, Behrouz Ehsani and Mehdi Hassani. Their trial, as is always the case, was deeply unfair, was marred by disturbing allegations of torture and forced confessions, and they were executed by hanging. And it's a wrenching reminder, isn't it, that while there has been tremendous momentum in many countries, which I'll come to in a moment, our collective global campaign to abolish the death penalty continues to be so urgently necessary. And it is certainly a wretched reminder of how cruel and widespread the death penalty continues to be in Iran, increasingly so. And we've just heard reminders of that powerfully in Abbas's opening personal reflections. Amnesty International reports that in 2024, there were at least 972 executions in Iran. The rate of executions has increased dramatically this year. Earlier this year, Human Rights Watch referred to it as an execution spree. And noted that during the first 4 months of the year, the rate of executions was up 75% over the same period the previous year, an average of at least 3 people being executed every day. And now Iran Human Rights has recently reported that at least 612 people were executed in just the first 6 months of this year, which is 119% higher than last year. So troubling has this become. In fact, I just noticed a couple of hours ago that today the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has spoken out, indicating that, quote, reports that there have been several hundred executions in Iran so far this year underscore how deeply disturbing the situation has become and the urgent need for an immediate moratorium in the country on the use of the death penalty. Those 612 people, of course, are not just statistics. They were real people who lived and loved. They were real people who had people in their lives who loved them. And Behrouz and Mehdi are so much more than the harrowing story about their unjust imprisonment, torture, persecution, and death. What I do want to draw our attention to, though, and this is what brings us back specifically to our topic today, is one of the charges that was brought against Behrouz and Mehdi, used to justify their execution, was, and I'll probably get the pronunciation not quite right, but moharebe, which I understand translates roughly as waging war against God. Note that language, waging war. It really struck me. And it's perhaps not the context that comes to mind when we think of today's theme, war and capital punishment. But I think it's a very sobering indication of the many ways in which the narrative and language of war is used to justify the death penalty and to shield and mask the use of the death penalty. If it is war from another nation, from within the nation, against the regime, against God, real may that war be, or entirely bogus and fabricated, governments give themselves license to kill. And people, the general public, feel more reticent and uncertain about pushing back and challenging the death penalty in such contexts, because they're made to feel fearful. They're made to feel insecure. After all, it is war. And in times of war, well, death is inevitable, and so be it, if that will keep me safe. I know this has likely been covered by several, perhaps many speakers in previous sessions, but I did want to start with a quick reminder of what international law has to say about the death penalty in general, and then about the death penalty and war in particular. As international human rights standards were being codified within the UN over 50 years ago, the death penalty was, of course, still very commonplace throughout the world. The right to life is, in so many respects, the core universal human rights promise, yet states did not initially fully commit themselves to that right when elaborating the promise. The exception, I need not say what it is, I know we all know it, the explicit exception, of course, was the death penalty. So when one of the two foundational UN human rights treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, was adopted almost 60 years ago in 1966. The right to life was one of its principal cornerstone provisions, but it was not unconditional. States carved out a specific exception for the death penalty. It wasn't a wholesale exception. There were limits requiring, for instance, they would only be imposed for the most serious crimes. Serious, of course, being an adjective very much in the eye of the beholding state. It would not be imposed on minors, and pregnant women were not to be executed. Worth reminding ourselves that at that time, 1966, only 12 countries had abolished the death penalty. And bringing it home, at least for me here in Canada, the last executions in Canada had been only 4 years earlier, when Ronald Turpin and Arthur Lucas were hanged at Toronto's Don Jail. In fact, the death penalty was still legally in force and on the books in Canada. That wouldn't change for another 10 years until 1976. And in fact, very relevant to our topic today, the possibility of a death sentence under Canadian military law was not removed until 1998. The right to life provisions, as enshrined in the Covenant in 1966, set restrictions, but allowed the death penalty, and that reflected a world in which the overwhelming majority of states still regularly executed people as part of their criminal justice systems. So 12 countries had abolished it in 1966. But fast forward 58 years, though, and Amnesty International reports that only 15 countries are known to have carried out executions last year, the lowest number on record for the second consecutive year. 113 have fully abolished the death penalty in their laws or constitutions. 145 have abolished it in law or practice. The UN Human Rights Committee now suggests that that growing number of abolitionist states is likely reflective of emerging consensus that the death penalty constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading punishment, which is, of course, prohibited under international law. Now, as abolition has gathered steam, what most people now describe as unstoppable momentum, states have taken further steps to strengthen the applicable international law, most particularly through what is known as the Second Optional Protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which commits states to abolition. That protocol entered into force in 1991, and there are currently 91 states parties. That includes Canada. It clearly does not include Iran, nor does it include the United States, nor China, the country known to have the highest rate of executions in the world. Encouraging? I pose that as a question. Of course it is. The momentum towards abolition of the death penalty over the past 50 years has been constant, and I would say it's been driven by a clear understanding that the right to life, yes, must be absolute. Which brings us to war. Now, in many respects, it feels counterintuitive to even be talking about the death penalty in relation to, in the context of war. After all, isn't war all about exactly the opposite? Isn't war about killing? Certainly, that is what the battlefield tells us. Though with protections even here for the right to life, a wounded soldier, a soldier taken prisoner, are no longer legitimate targets to kill. And no matter what, civilians are to be protected and can never be deliberately, indiscriminately, or disproportionately targeted for death. The Geneva Conventions, adopted in 1949, and there are 2 additional protocols from 1977 laying out the laws of war, deal with the death penalty in particular contexts, such as when a prisoner of war or a civilian in occupied territory commits a criminal offense. And as with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it is allowed, but many of the same exceptions and limitations still apply. Notably, when states did take the step of adopting the optional protocol that I referred to a minute ago to enshrine a renewed, strengthened commitment to death penalty abolition, even here, states wanted to keep the possibility of executions open in times of war. On one hand, it's worth noting the optional protocol has a very strong prohibition on any reservations being made by states ratifying the instrument, and that is not at all commonplace with human rights treaties. But there's an exception. So yes, they do not get to sign on saying, yes, we abolish the death penalty, and then say, except if it is a mass murderer, or except if the victim is a child, or except if the murderer shows no remorse. None of those reservations are allowed. But the optional protocol does allow states to enter reservation that, quote, provides for the application of the death penalty in time of war. Now it goes on again to have some open-ended and problematically flexibility terms. It's only with respect to serious crimes, crimes of a military nature, and even I would suggest the notion of during wartime is perhaps not a always obvious context. So where does it bring us? Let me make 3 observations. The first is we must push back against the notion that there is something sacrosanct and untouchable about wartime, such that we are willing to ease up and even roll back on crucial human rights safeguards, such as abolition of the death penalty. Is a soldier who deserts or is treasonous truly more dangerous and deserving of forfeiting their life than a mass murderer who rapes and kills children? The momentum around the death penalty that has been so significant for one fundamental reason. We have embraced the core understanding that the right to life is at the heart of what it is to have human rights, what it is to be a human, and what it is to live together in shared humanity. And as such, as a society, as a nation, as a government, there can be no circumstances in which we deliberately end life through a state-sanctioned execution. If we truly uphold life for all, we will go far in protecting life for all of us, wartime or not. Second, a word about the blurred line between the death penalty and extrajudicial executions, both of which, of course, shatter the right to life, but in very different circumstances. Death through capital punishment, theoretically, is delivered openly, though that is often blatantly contravened. Look at the secrecy of the death penalty in China, for instance. Following a legal verdict, though the proceedings, of course, are often fundamentally unjust and unfair and poisoned by the use of torture, witness Iran. But theoretically, that's what the death penalty is all about. Extrajudicial executions are anything but. They are arbitrary, they are unaccountable assassinations, essentially, on a street corner, in a prison cell, in a car, while at sleep. And in today's world, they are often carried out on the battlefield, and increasingly through precise, deadly, targeted drone attacks. That has been a signature tactic used by Israeli forces to go after Hamas leaders in Gaza, for instance. Think also of Israel's sophisticated campaign that led to the deadly explosion of thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies of Hezbollah militants and leaders in Lebanon last year. The US military also carries out drone executions in countries around the world, has done so for years. There's no shortage of legal debate about the illegality or legality of such attacks, the applicability of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and the different considerations that would apply if it is in fact in the midst of a full-blown armed conflict or not. We don't have time, and I don't think there's the space to go into all of that. But just think of some of these considerations and think of it in comparison to the death penalty and how it gets used, no matter who they may be, including a leader of a notorious terrorist or militant group. What if the person who is targeted is injured? What if they would have surrendered if confronted by a human rather than a remotely controlled machine? What I want to leave with us on this point is that we should bring our opposition to the death penalty to such situations. We cannot allow the fog of war and the rapid advance of artificial intelligence and technology to become an end run around the gains we have made through strengthened provisions and consensus prohibiting capital punishment. The third point I wanted to touch on is what of civilian protection and war and the death penalty? Does it not feel as if fundamental principles around civilian protection are being not just tested, but shattered and decimated in real time these days all over the world. Certainly the crushing horror of Israeli genocide in Gaza, certainly Russia's unrelenting waves of drones targeting civilians in Russia, in Ukraine, certainly the brutal toll of civil war in Sudan. But it isn't capital punishment, so why do I raise it? Well, think of it another way. Think about Gaza in particular and what Israel's campaign collectively against Palestinians trapped and imprisoned in the Gaza Strip represents. Does it not imply something along the following lines? If you are Palestinian and you live in Gaza, you are guilty by virtue of where you were born and where you live and who you are, and you have thus forfeited your life. You are responsible for and complicit in the crimes of Hamas because of who you are and where you live, and you will therefore be punished, even through death, and even if you are a child, be it by bombardment, shelling, or starvation. You may be executed, or you may be sentenced to a slow death. Well, while we gather strength from the progress we have seen in consigning the death penalty to the past, in most, but certainly not yet all countries, we must recognize that states are bold and defiant in essentially sentencing, yes, those involved in fighting and attacks, but also civilians to extrajudicial, unaccountable, and illegal death during war. Which brings me to some final words about the state of international law and accountability at a time of considerable conflict, upheaval, and contempt for the international legal order. The remarkable progress there has been towards abolition of the death penalty, and it has been notable and remarkable, is very much rooted in a full embrace of what is the most crucial dimension of international human rights after all, that they are universal, they apply to everyone, everywhere, and always. Now, that notion of universality has, of course, always been elusive. We know that. It is the most cruelly betrayed aspect of the human rights promise. We can see that in entrenched racism, sexism, and homophobia around the world. That is what allows refugees and migrants to be demonized and excluded from safety. That is what makes the Holocaust, the Rwandan, Rohingya, and Gaza genocides possible. That is what fuels the obscene gap between extreme wealth and extreme poverty in our world. That is what allows hate and demonization to spread like wildfire in our digital world. It does, though, does it not, feel that we are in a time in which that sense of universality is now being deliberately dismantled? Amongst others, is that not what Donald Trump represents above all? On one hand, we are turning to world courts, notably the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, with more determination and expectation than ever to reaffirm and uphold international human rights protections. We've seen that again in recent days as activists and frontline communities and governments have embraced and lifted up last week's remarkable advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the international legal consequences of the global climate crisis. On the other hand, the challenges and disregard for those international courts is, to say the least, troubling. And the ability of our international legal order to uphold those rulings by the only body empowered to do so, the UN Security Council, is not just hampered, it's thwarted by the disgraceful veto, which is regularly wielded by the US, Russia, and China to protect themselves and their allies from accountability for death, accountability for mass atrocities, a veto which allows this march of death to proceed. So where does all of that leave us? It's not a time with easy and obvious answers, but it is a time that calls on us all to step forward. That is undeniable. If ever there was a time that old saying, silence is not an option, matters so very much, this is that time. And that means, yes, continuing to turn to the courts, to UN processes and experts and other international institutions entrusted and empowered to defend and uphold international law. Those of us who can be part of advancing and arguing such cases must do so. The rest of us should look for ways to support the cases, promote the rulings, and demand compliance. That means being relentless in our insistence and expectation that our own governments, Canada in my case, will put international law, in particular human rights and humanitarian legal standards, first in everything they do on the world stage, and will take the steps that show we really mean that, such as imposing sanctions, restricting trade, refusing to sell arms, and pursuing criminal prosecutions. And above all, that means solidarity with individuals, groups, and communities who are most imperiled at this time, through our activism, through our financial support, and simply by speaking out and spreading the word. We heard from High Commissioner Volker Turk today that there are at least 48 people on death row in Iran. At the present time, 12 of whom are believed to be at risk of imminent execution. Let's act for them. Edward Zakrzewski is scheduled to be executed in Florida on Thursday of this week. Let's act for him. And the people of Gaza have essentially been sentenced to death simply because of who they are and where they live. Let's act for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And apologies, my internet went down, so I was not able to give the introduction that I had written for you. So I'm going to give it again because I wasn't able to.
Oh, there's no need.
I know I have to. Alex is an adjunct professor in international human rights law at the University of Ottawa and Dalhousie University, and a senior fellow with the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He served as Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada from 2000 to 2020. That's 2 decades. And I don't know if you remember, Alex, but 22 years ago, when you were Secretary General, you had invited me to speak at an Amnesty Canada meeting about the case of Zahra Kazemi. This was in a church on Danforth in the East End of Toronto. And I'll never forget that. That was the first time I was speaking publicly. I think I was maybe 22 at that age. And I have Zahra Kazemi here behind me, as you can see. We'll move on now to our second panelist, Mahmoud Amiri Moghaddam, co-founder and spokesperson for the NGO Iran Human Rights, which monitors the violations of human rights in Iran. Mr. Amiri Moghaddam is well known as a defender of human rights. He received the Norwegian Amnesty International's Human Rights Prize in 2007 for his work against human rights violations in Iran. Mr. Amiri Moghaddam is also a professor in medicine and head of the Laboratory of Molecular Neuroscience at the University of Oslo. Just does that in his spare time. Mahmoud, the microphone is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Samira. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I have already learned a lot from Alex and Abbas Azadian. It's also a pleasure for me to be in a panel with my good friend Hossein Raisi. First time I communicated with him, he was a human rights lawyer defending death row prisoners, the most marginalized in Iran. I think it was about 15 years ago. And now we both are sitting here, unfortunately, outside our country, but we don't give up. I would like to give a very short introduction of Iran human rights and what we are doing before talking about today's theme about how the war will impact the death penalty or how death penalty is used during time of war in Iran. So if you allow me, I will let's see if the technicalities work. You see my, let's see.
Yeah, everything looks good.
Yes, perfect. So Iran human rights has been around for about 20 years now. Death penalty has been a main focus of our activities, but we also work on other human rights violations, and we are also members of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. I'm in Norway, so that's where the organization was found, but our members and associates are across the world and also in Iran. So we have a broad network in Iran. And if you go to our website, you will see that, let's see, do you see the page? Yeah, still. We have a counter on top of the website where you can see the number of executions. Unfortunately, it changes every day, maybe several times a day. So as of this morning, it was 685 executions so far in 2025. So as Alex was pointing out, an average of more than 3 executions every day. So every 8 hours, 1 execution. And as of now, the numbers have increased to 688. There are 3 cases that we haven't published yet, but they are confirmed, and you probably will not hear these names, or maybe you have never heard of them. I hadn't heard these names. Isa Narui and Amir Gambari. There were 2, I think one of them was a Baluch minority executed this morning in Minab, in southern Iran. And so these things happen every day. Yesterday, there was a group execution of 10 people in Yazd, 9 men and 1 woman. So you can follow us on our social media, and whenever you want to update, see what is going on, you can look at this website. The way we do it, Iranian authorities, like in China, there is lack of transparency in Iran as well. So Iranian authorities announce less than 10% of all executions. These numbers are from 2024. The greens are the numbers that authorities announce. The orange, they are the ones that we managed to confirm through 2 independent sources. Given the risk that is involved, in sending information to human rights organizations, nowadays, actually, these people can be sentenced to death for espionage when they send this kind of information. You can imagine that the actual numbers are much higher. And if you look at the numbers since 2018, you see a strong surge from 2022, at the end of 2022, and then 23, 24. It's increasing. And so what happened at the end of 2022? We all remember the Women Life Freedom movement that started. And since then, we have seen this surge, and it's getting more and more. I will come back to it. But what we see is that the timing of executions is closely correlated with political events. Who are the people who are executed? This is from 2023 again. You see that more than 90%, or about 90%, are for what we would call common crimes like drug-related charges and murder. A smaller number, 5%, are muharebe and corruption on earth that Alex referred to. These are typically charges that are used against political opponents, political prisoners. They are vague, but we also have, in 2023, we had 2 cases of blasphemy, 1 adultery. But the majority are executed for crimes such as possession or trafficking of drugs, or for murder. Also, about the 2 political prisoners who were executed yesterday, we have torture, lack of access to lawyer. The lawyers very often do not get access to the files, They don't know what they are going to defend. Very often, people are sentenced to death, and after that, they get actually permission to have a look in the cases. But it's not only about the political prisoners. Also drug offenders or those who are charged for possession of drugs, they are sentenced to death by the revolutionary courts, the same courts that take care of political opponents. And also their sentence is based on confessions. So in these 20 years, we haven't met one single death row prisoner who has not been forced to give a confession and being sentenced to death based on that confession. So here the distinction between extrajudicial execution and death penalty becomes much more difficult, I think. I would also just like to make a correction. The High Commissioner today in his statement mentioned 48 death row prisoners. What he actually meant was 48 political prisoners on death row, because there are like thousands of death row prisoners in Iran now. So I stop sharing now. So I think that there are 3 points I would like to make here. One is that the aim of the executions, although majority of those executed are sentenced to death for common crimes, the aim is not to counter crimes. Iranian authorities, I think more than anyone else, know that using death penalty for drug offenses in more than 45 years not only hasn't led to any deterrence, the drug abuse and trafficking has been increasing, and they have admitted it several times, but they still continue these executions. The aim is to create fear in the society. I think most of us remember the horrible pictures. When somebody says ISIS, I think what comes into our mind is the picture of mass executions. They were doing it almost every day in the areas they were controlling. Maybe in the beginning, they were executing, the military forces of Syria or others. But after a while, it didn't matter who the person was. The aim was to send this clear message to the people that we have the power, we have the political will, and we can kill for that. So this gives people a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, and that's how they manage to hold on to power. Like Iranian authorities, we also during the woman life freedom movement that most people in Iran want to have a change, a fundamental change. But, and it's not because, only because we are dealing with an oppressive regime, but it's also a highly corrupt and incompetent regime. Nowadays they cannot provide water to people, electricity to people, and I think all these three, being oppressive, corrupt, and incompetent, go hand in hand. So the only way to hold on the power in a country of 80 to 90 million is to give them this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, and appear more powerful than they are. So, and the victims, they are among the weakest in the society. I think it's very important to keep in mind that political cost matters, even for the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that's the reason why majority of those who are executed, nobody has heard of them. They are not well known. They don't have a network. They are not. There are no campaigns to save them. But the impact of their executions is the same. It sends the same message to the people. And ethnic minorities are overrepresented among them. Since last year, Afghan migrants, we have seen a surge in execution of Afghans. And we fear that now, after this war, this becomes even worse because, since during these 12 days of war, in addition to their incompetence in everything else, they also demonstrated incompetence in even protecting themselves. They are trying to put the blame, on internal spies. They have arrested around 2,000 people with espionage charges. Some of them we know that they were arrested because they had the video footage on their cell phone of somewhere that was bombed. And so some of them for sure will be charged with espionage, which is corruption on earth and moharebe, as you said. And they might be executed. So the impact of war is that the regime is even weaker, even more threatened than before, and has even bigger need to create fear. And now that so many people are arrested for espionage charges, of course, we are very concerned that many of them might be executed under these charges. The other point is that you see, this surge in execution actually became intensified 2 days after Hassan Nasrallah was killed in Beirut. Remember, the head of Hezbollah. And at that time, everybody was talking about the possible war between Iran and Israel. So in the shadow of this war, the number of executions increased so that from an average of 2 to 3 before that, for 8 months, we had 6 executions in average every single day. And that's, more than 1,000 people were executed. And at the same time, not only international media, but also Farsi media were not paying any attention to it. All the attention was on a possible war between Iran and Israel, and after that on negotiations with the US administration. So lack of international attention is another thing. So the founder of the Islamic Republic, I think Abbas Azadian, very well described it, that during the Iran-Iraq war, Iranian authorities basically dismantled any kind of opposition inside the country with mass executions without any political cost. So the founder of Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, used to say that war is a blessing from God. And this is, I think, what we fear, that, a regime that is threatened from inside, because let's be honest, I think we all know that it's not Mossad or Israeli spies who are the biggest threat to the Islamic Republic. It's the Iranian people, young Iranians who want to change, who are the main threat. And I think that Islamic Republic will try to use this opportunity to crack down as much as possible. So I think I will stop here. So I would just like to emphasize that please follow the news. We fear that the 2 political prisoners who were executed yesterday, they are just that might be just the beginning. Now that the political cost of these executions are low, we fear that there will be many more in addition to ordinary executions, what we call ordinary executions, because all executions in Iran are political. But we might have a mass execution of also political opponents. But what can help is raising the political cost of these executions. This can be done by protests inside the country, but also by international pressure. Right now, Iranian authorities, they need to improve their relations with all the other countries, like, in Europe, maybe even with Canada. And there, I think, in any dialogue with the Islamic Republic and countries that are committed to the human rights, issue of the death penalty and human rights must be on the top of the agenda. And I think there is possibility to put pressure on them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Amiri Moghaddam. I recall, even before Israel began its bombing campaign in Iran, people were warning about activists, civil activists within the country bearing the brunt of Israel's attack. And so now we're seeing that come about. Our next panelist for today is our very own Omid Milani. He is a scholar of human rights law and a multimedia artist interested in interdisciplinary and transformative approaches to the current discourse on human rights. Omid's research interests include a wide range of subjects: law and aesthetics, domestic and state-sponsored violence, constitutional rights and freedoms, and political philosophy, and socio-legal studies of human rights. Omid is a fellow at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Omid, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Samira, and many thanks to Abbas, Mahmoud, and Alex for sharing their insights with us today. I would like to also thank the organizers who have made a lot of effort to make this session happen on a Monday in the middle of the summer. It's not an easy thing to get panelists, and also I would like to thank our attendees today who have made the time to participate in this session. I would like to be brief and share a few observations and suggest a few elements of complexity for our discussion today. And I wish to begin by acknowledging that looking at the subject matter of our discussion today, it is imperative to adopt a human perspective that is informed by the experiences of the victims. And I think we can no longer afford developing or having an uninvolved, detached perspective on the issue that we are discussing today. And I think everyone is involved in a way. And I do think that it is needed for us to deconstruct this so-called perspective of the observer that is somewhat scientific, detached, and removed from the context. We're all involved in a way in what is happening, no matter where in our world, in the same sense that the cells of a human body are all interconnected, all members of the human family are interconnected. And I think that it is important to acknowledge that looking at the issue from that perspective is not only imperative, but also quite natural, and it helps us gain relevance and sensibility when it comes to those significant issues that involve human suffering and pain. And it is quite similar to a play that was written by Matej Wisniewicz in after the Bosnian War, entitled "The Body of a Woman as a Battlefield in the Bosnian War." So when a person is hanged or a bullet is fired at an individual human being, I feel it in my body, and I think for many of us it is the case, and we are all involved in a sense. And from that point of view, I would like to look at the two concepts that we're discussing today, war and capital punishment. And through that prism, to me, it appears that both of these phenomena are manifestations of what one can call the right to kill. The right to kill has been discussed in many philosophical investigations, namely Jacques Derrida's seminars on the death penalty, and it is a self-proclaimed right to kill human individuals in the name of the state, for the state, and I emphasize on not using by the state, because state on itself doesn't have any agency, and it always requires a human being to be involved in the act of killing. And it is quite important for us to acknowledge that abstract nature of a state and to realize that there's always a human involved, whether it is in the case of extrajudicial killing by a drone or the death penalty. It's always a judge, a soldier, a human somewhere directly involved who is perpetrating the act of violence. So to conduct war and death penalty in the name of the state, for the state, resembles somewhat religious to me, and religious, conduct. It resembles defending an abstract notion that doesn't have any agency in the absence of human input, human conduct itself. So the whole experience of war and the experience of the death penalty for its victims, both of them appear to be human sacrifice, and it's in that sense quite relevant to discuss these two matters in connection to one another. And the state that is claimed to be defended through the exercise of the right to kill always abuses the mass media to portray itself, to show its power. And as Mahmoud pointed out, it wants to manufacture a kind of economy of fear through showing its abuse of violence and use of lethal force in both cases. So in that sense, as I said, the right to kill is exercised in both wars and instances of the death penalty. And I think it's important for us to look at the origins of this right to kill, where it is coming from, where it has been conceived or misconceived. And I think it is misconstrued and misconceived in the right to self-defense, this timeless legal right to self-defense that is an individual right, and it has never been meant to protect a divine entity or an abstract entity. Nevertheless, the state invokes that right to protect itself, to claim that it is conducting a war or carrying out capital punishment in order to protect itself. And this is a perverse understanding of the right to self-defense. And I say that it is perverse due to the fact that it is based on a mistake of determining and locating the sovereign. In human rights discourse, the state is no longer sovereign, and we have to be clear about this fact. And we have to know that pre-World War II and pre-human rights era, the state used to be perceived as the sovereign, and it is a lethal mistake to perceive the abstract state as sovereign over actual, real human beings. And there are consequences of this lethal mistake. For example, by recognizing or perceiving the state as sovereign, we create a kind of confusion in the abolitionist discourse and also in human rights discourse, a kind of confusion that would give rise to ambiguity and lack of transparency. And as my colleagues pointed out correctly, the pretexts for carrying out the death penalty are often to be sought in vague criminal categories. Waging war against God, muharebe, or corruption on Earth, facade fil ars, and so on and so forth, are all vague categories that are invoked as pretexts to justify protecting an abstract entity. So this is quite important for us to acknowledge this lethal mistake of perceiving the state as superior over the actual human beings. This is no longer the case in human rights era, and I think we need to raise this bold question as to who the sovereign is. And if it is not the state, then we must be clear about the fact that we are not getting or receiving our rights from any political entity, be it a state or otherwise, or any divine entity. There is no God with capital G for us to bestow upon us some qualities to be worthy of human rights. We don't owe our dignity to anyone. We don't get our rights and freedoms from any political entity. So this is something that needs to be addressed. And it is only in the shadow of perceiving the state as sovereign over actual human beings that we can create ambiguity and abuse criminal categories and processes to carry out killing, basically. And it also creates a culture of impunity for the states to avoid responsibility when it comes to their conduct. So by naming the actual human beings who are involved in those processes, we can go beyond the culture of impunity that has been commonplace in not only international law and also domestically in human rights issues. We need to speak unto humans concerning human rights. And that's, I think, a revolutionary aspect of human rights that has been ignored, and we can no longer do so. We need to speak onto personalities and actual human beings, and we need to go beyond the abstraction of states, not to let individuals to afford impunity and immunity to international mechanisms or other legal mechanisms that are not possible these days to be used in an effective fashion to hold those individuals accountable. Also, it creates an environment that is apt for double standards. It's only in the presence of certain states as abstract entities that we can afford double standards in our today's world. And once we deconstruct that abstract aspect of the state, we are left with what is real, a real story that is about the perpetrator and the victim. And then we cannot afford double standards. We cannot invoke double standards as means of avoiding in direct engagement and involvement with issues that are discussed, for example, whether intellectually or otherwise, in legal processes as well. The issue of double standards is quite important, and to hold individuals also accountable for their deeds, we need to be aware of that aspect of the state as an abstraction that has no agency, no content in the absence of human input. It's basically a pattern of conduct, a collection of symbols. And I think human rights discourse is today ready to go beyond that extant implication of the state that is quite archaic, quite ancient, and we need to be aware of the limits that it imposes on the discourse of the the capital punishment abolition and also human rights discourse. So moving towards the abolition of the right to kill that is exercised by individuals in the name of the state, I think, as I said, we need to revisit the notion of sovereignty. We need to be clear about the fact that who or what constitutes sovereign in international law, in human rights discourse. And it's only in light of that critical revision that we can give back to peoples what they have been deprived of, their agencies, and we can hold individuals accountable for their deeds. I think those were as I said, complex of elements of complexity that I wanted to share. And for the sake of time, I think I'll stop here, and I look forward to further exchanging our opinions and ideas as to war and capital punishment in the Q&A period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omid. I'd like to stress everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A box here at the bottom. Before I go on to ask some of those questions, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We will not be having a session in August, and session 7 will be on capital punishment and the Iranian legal system with a focus on Islamic law. That'll be on September 20th. And I just want to give a reminder to everyone that's joining us. You can watch all of these sessions, so 1 through 6, and then after on the YouTube of Payvan Society, and the link for that has been put here in the chat. Omid, if I could just start, I was hoping that you could maybe parse out a little more this idea of the state as an abstract entity. And I wanted to ask you how the nature of the state complicates that, because if you're looking specifically at Iran, the state itself is seen as being sacred. That's how the government in Iran, sort of views itself. So how do you sort of, I guess, combat that? How do you deal with that when you have a state that sort of views itself as sacred, so that any opposition to it really does become, in its own head, waging war against God, waging war against the state?
I think that's an excellent question, Samira. I think we need to remind everyone that the state or any political entity, any political or legal system is a creation by individuals and peoples. So we need to remind everyone that the agency remains with individual human beings, and there is nothing divine or nothing sacred about a political system. But it's quite relevant to look at the abstraction that's involved in the state apparatuses, ideological or repressive, as a theological proposition, if you will. So, in the sense to put the bedrock of the state beyond the reach of individuals is a tactic to cover certain conducts of the state, to, as I said, avoid responsibility and liability for their acts. And there is nothing sacred about any system. We need to be aware of that. We need to be clear about that. And the question of sovereignty here is key to kind of revolutionize the discourse on human rights, and also the abolitionist discourse, moving towards the abolition of the right to kill. I think you are muted, Samira.
Of course I will. Alex, I just wanted to ask you, jumping off what Omid said about this question of sovereignty, our whole sort of international law legal system is built on the idea of nation states and sovereignty. How do you move beyond that when the entire legal system seems to be built on that?
$1 million question. I mean, that is absolutely where our challenges lie. There have been many efforts to do so. I think many people will be well familiar with the Canadian-led process about 2 decades ago now, which led to the adoption of what's known as the responsibility to protect doctrine. And, I think very importantly, part of that process was about reimagining and revisiting this notion of sovereignty being this inviolable principle at the heart of the entire international legal order. And I'll kind of give my own spin on it and a brief review, but really what came out of that was a notion of sovereignty is something earned, and sovereignty is something lost. And that in particular, what that process, what that panel was looking at was this notion that many states pushed the international community away arguing sovereignty in instances of mass atrocities, in instances of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, would push back saying, our country, our business, our sovereignty, stay away, we can do what we want. And the responsibility to protect refutes that and notes that sovereignty is contingent upon regard for fundamental universal human rights, and that in particular, when a state takes that particularly egregious, awful step of committing mass atrocities, then they are no longer entitled to claim that sovereignty. And the flip side of it, therefore, is that the rest of the world has a responsibility to respond and engage and take action. And I think we tend to focus on sort of, I guess, the last stage of that kind of action, which is this notion of, the UN Security Council authorizes a military intervention to go into a country and address genocide, etc. But the responsibility to protect says it begins long before that, because, of course, ultimately, what we want to be doing in instances where it's clear that a state has lost its sovereignty or may be at risk of doing so is ensuring that we're taking early action to prevent that from getting worse. Now, all sounds good, perhaps. So where are we 20 years later? Where is the responsibility to protect in Gaza? Where is the responsibility to protect in Ukraine? Where is the responsibility to protect in Afghanistan, in Sudan? On goes the list, right? And so there we have the eternal challenge of the kinds of blockages and barriers we have in that international legal system that stand in the way of some of these concepts really gaining traction. And here in particular, we have the fact that many of the states who have the greatest vested interest in standing by that old notion of sovereignty gives us, the state, a free pass, are the ones who, for instance, by exerting Security Council vetoes, can stand in the way of action. And I guess the last thing I will say, therefore, is that all brings it back to us. We're the ones, therefore, who have to reclaim that notion of sovereignty, have to make it clear that sovereignty as we know it, demand it, and live it, is something that the state, whatever that may be in a particular context, earns and the state loses, and make sure that we continue the clamor for that to be upheld and respected.
Thank you so much. Mahmoud, do you have any thing to say on this idea of sovereignty and the way the state uses sovereignty as a shield to mask itself from criticisms about egregious human rights violations, etc.? Oh, you're muted.
Of course. But I think both Alex and Omid addressed it sufficiently. I mean, what I want to add is that, we have been pushed back. Some years ago, there was hope that, we are moving towards a stronger, let's say, international community that could, could be above the individual states. And but in the recent years, I feel that we have moved back many years. Now again, we are where, let's say, where the power is, the right is there, right? That's and I think that it brings us back to our individual responsibilities. I don't think we can expect so much from states, from governments, from politicians. But what we can do something about is to be more responsible individual citizens. And I think that, maybe it sounds very utopic, but I think individuals there are many individuals who think the same way, but they just feel powerless. They don't think that they can have any impact, and I think that's something that we need to change, because this the rules that that we see in the world, they keep changing depending on who has the power now. Sometimes we have let's say leaders, political leaders who respect the international law. Sometimes they don't, and as long as they have a lot of power, there is not much other countries can do. And it's the nature of politics, and many politicians who are very pragmatic, who think short term. But I think citizens, we are in a different situation. We don't need to care about our position. I think we need to promote more responsible citizens.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to some of the questions in the chat here. This one is for you, Omid. It says, it seems, Omid, that you want to put responsibility on the individual committing the killing, but in authoritarian regimes, individuals may not have any choice. They may be killed themselves if they object. Is this not true?
The individual aspect of our responsibilities for our deeds is an irreducible notion. We cannot afford dismissing that aspect of our human being and human doing by means of disguising ourselves under some abstract notions such as the state, God, and so on and so forth. So it is rather to humanize the discourse. It is rather to unmask the state. It is rather to remind the individuals of the fact that they have the power. They have the power, and even in democratic societies, we have the state by means of a contract, by means of an agreement between individuals and communities on the one hand, and the state on the other. That is, as I said, a collection of symbols and also patterns of conduct. If the people do not want those symbols and patterns of conduct in place, they should be able to remove them. They should be able to change them, because they are the actual creators of those symbols and patterns. So the idea is to see what a viable way is to move beyond this state of impunity, that is this culture of impunity that we have in international law, for example, that certain countries afford, such as Israel, to commit war crimes and genocides and go unpunished effectively. And also domestically, certain countries such as Iran can afford killing individuals for waging war against God or corruption on earth, while avoiding any any effective mechanism to be questioned, to be held responsible, and so forth. So the idea is here to humanize the discourse, to humanize the problem, and to try to find a viable path forward towards, as the title of our series suggests, towards the abolition of the death penalty and the abolition of the right to kill, whether in wars or in domestic criminal laws.
Now, I think that the Nuremberg trial sort of effectively did away with this idea that I had no choice or I had no agency when I acted as a soldier. I think we've really moved beyond this idea at this point. Alex, Mahmoud, do you have anything to share on that?
Actually, you said exactly what I was going to say. Well, not just the focus on Nuremberg, but more widely to point out that we do have this notion well embedded in international law now that doesn't give you an out. You don't get to commit genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity because you were ordered to do so, and that there may be consequences for you if you did. That may be, perhaps if we reach the stage of being sentenced for your involvement in war crimes, the fact that you were threatened or under duress or that your life was at risk may be something to take into account in terms of the nature of the penalty and sanction you should receive, but it does not absolve you from guilt or responsibility.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think that we should also keep in mind that these authoritarian regimes, they are composed of individuals, and not all individuals believe 100% in that regime or in that system. Many of them do it because of their benefits. Some of them do it out of fear. And I think that again, if we bring back, the responsibility to or put focus on our individual responsibility. If we are many, then the price that we are paying for disobedience becomes much lower. And I think, there is always a price. It doesn't come. We are talking about fundamental values, and I think that all individuals should be willing to pay a price. But again, it's contagious. The power of saying no, it's very strong, and it is also contagious, and it can move. It can dismantle the biggest authoritarian regimes.
And Samira, can I add one other point here? I think another area that we need to be cognizant of as being relevant here is the whole area of refugee protection, because we should ensure that there are avenues open for people who do want to, and we often use the word desertion, but it's a choice of conscience to disavow themselves and stop any kind of association with a regime of that sort. And perhaps they even have had some degree of involvement already in the commission of atrocities. And very often the law is unclear in this area, and it differs from country to country, but there are not ready avenues by which our protection regimes through refugee systems offer an avenue, encourage people to take that step. Even if there may be, later some degree of accountability for crimes they have committed, refugee regimes tend to kind of try to shut down in that context. You've been involved in misdeeds and crimes, therefore we're not going to touch you.
Thank you so much. There was a very specific question by an anonymous attendee that I'd like you all to address. So this was about the drone attack that happened on a nuclear scientist. I'm assuming these are the nuclear scientists that were killed in Iran. The question is, would a drone attack on a nuclear scientist be considered a form of imposing a death penalty in war or a war crime in targeting civilians? It's a difficult question.
Well, I don't think it's, in the formal sense of how we understand the death penalty, it is not the death penalty, because the death penalty does come about through, even though it's often a sham, even though it's often profoundly unfair, even though it's often totally secretive, it does come about through some sort of legal process. There's a judgment rendered, there's a verdict, and then the execution. I would suggest that this instead takes us into the realm of what we consider to be extrajudicial executions, which are illegal under international law. There's no question about that, and I think the degree to which extrajudicial executions, in the past, EJEs, as they're often known as, were carried out by people. It was death squads. Think back to the 1980s in Central America, etc., and someone being whisked away and then extrajudicially executed in a field somewhere rather than taken to court. Now we have this chilling, horrifying prospect of EJEs by technology. And it has taken us into a whole new realm. I think the international legal order is kind of scrambling to keep up with that and kind of make decisions as to how to respond and to ensure that it gets properly dealt with. But yes, depending on the circumstances, it could also very much constitute a war crime. A scientist is a civilian, likely, depending on their role, depending on what they're involved in. Lawyers love, our first answer is usually, it depends. So there is a sense of it depends here. We'd need to know a lot about the details, but certainly the potential for that to be a war crime is very real.
Would anyone else like to take that on? No? Okay, let's move on to, there's a question here about individuals who carry out state-sanctioned executions and how might this knowledge inform strategies for ending capital punishment. So they're asking, if you know the specific individual who's carrying out this sort of state-sanctioned executions or murders, might this help in curbing that or ending capital punishment?
I didn't get.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just reading it. I'm not sure if I fully understand this. So they're asking if what do we know about the individuals who carry out state-sanctioned executions? How might this knowledge inform strategies for ending capital punishment?
If I may just quickly add an observation here. I think, Samira, you had a interview with some conscientious objectors a few months ago.
Yes, some young teenagers who refused to join the Israeli army.
I think our human conscience is the window through which we can look at the abolition of the death penalty, whether in the case of the abolition of the right to kill in the name of the state, whether in the case of the death penalty or war. Also, for example, physicians are under oath not to inflict harm on anyone, and if it is possible for them to prevent any such infliction. And they are sometimes involved in amputation in Iran, and if they refuse to do so, I can see that that would resonate, that would inspire many others in society. Of course, it wouldn't be priceless, but the price of being involved as an individual in such an act, psychologically or otherwise, is grim, is nothing to ignore. I think the window through which we can look at these instances of state-sponsored violence is through human conscience. And I think human conscience, reason, and dignity, all of them are mentioned in the UN Charter and also the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, are not given to us by any state. So we should claim sort of ownership of those notions. We should cherish them and be inspired by them in our conduct.
I can add to. I was actually thinking about this example of physicians. Some years ago there was this terrible punishment of blinding. Retribution in kind for blinding someone. So there was someone who was poured acid on the face of someone, and he was sentenced to be blinded. And this is something that takes place actually with the help of a physician. And I remember that in one instance they had they were not willing to do it. So it was in that specific case, it was postponed. I don't know what happened later, but just talking about it, that actually as an individual, you are responsible for what you are doing, regardless of what your role is, whether you are a physician who is, because, we have the oath, of course, I'm a physician myself, but also as soldiers, in prisons, very often, ordinary soldiers are asked to implement the execution. And they are just serving their service and happen to be, let's say, in a specific prison. And also there, just raising this issue, and if many soldiers say no, we are not willing to do it, I think it will have an impact. So it must start by raising the question. The most dangerous scenario is that they do it as if nothing has happened. They do it as if they are just pushing a button on a TV, while pushing the button leads to execution of 7 people. Have you seen? I recommend to see this movie of Muhammad Rasulov, There Is No Evil. I think that's what it's called. One part of it is about actually these soldiers who get 3 days furlough, those who take part in these executions. And this is real, based in real story. And you have always the choice to say no. And but you have to raise the question.
And, I would maybe broaden it out from the specific question about what do we know about individuals who carry out executions to more broadly, what do we know about individuals who carry out human rights violations? And I think there is a lot of really fascinating work that has been done. It's not at all my area of expertise. It's more, sociologists and psychologists, et cetera, have done some incredible work here. I think of a study I remember reading ages ago that looked at the question of how were members of the Greek military encouraged to engage in rampant torture during the time of the colonels, the military dictatorship in Greece. I can think of other pieces that have been written really exploring who exactly was it that became involved in the death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala. And there's a lot of commonalities. There's a common theme of poverty. There's a common theme of indoctrination. In all of those instances, I can think of very vivid descriptions of the kind of processes that those recruits went through of being really, sometimes brutally, but insidiously made to kind of see, whether it's communists or whoever it may be as the other, this evil source of threat, etc. So the point I wanted to make there is I think so much of it comes down to whenever we rupture the notion that we have a shared common humanity, I think we're laying the stage for people to step forward and serve as the executioner or the torturer, etc. And so a lot of this comes back to embracing, reinforcing, and doing everything we can, even in the small steps we take in our own lives, to be always lifting up the notion that we're all in this together, our humanity is shared, there are no differences and distinctions between us.
Thanks so
Can
much,
I
Alex.
just
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, just you see, in the totalitarian system, especially where religion is involved, like for example in Iran, it's also the authorities make also an attempt to involve ordinary citizens in their crimes, like make them complicit. For instance, and this is from very old ages, like stoning punishment, which was used before Christianity, and the last time it happened was 2009 in Iran, so it's not very remote, and it's still in the law. So it actually invites citizens to come and throw a stone. So each person should throw a stone. And by doing that, not only you are actually taking away responsibility from the shoulder of the oppressor, but you become part of it. And it's the same with the, qisas, retribution in kind. According to the qisas law, if somebody is murdered, the family of the victim, they make the decision whether the murderer should be executed or not, and they are also encouraged to take part into it. So this one goes beyond committing a crime, but also they are given the responsibility that actually the state has.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Mr. Amir Muqaddam, because we know also that Iran does carry out sort of public executions where it invites the citizenry to come and watch. So in that way, you almost become a spectator and an actor at the same time, sort of partaking in this spectacle. So the person who asked that question about knowing the individuals who do it, Jamie says that maybe it was misworded. So it goes back to your answer, Alex, about knowing the psychological makeup of people or maybe economic circumstances of the people who commit these sort of executions that happen on behalf of the state. And I think, as Jamie points out, they're saying that if perhaps if we knew the mindset, we could do something to, stop those executions from happening. The next question is, if a young man in Israel opposes conscription into the IDF, but leaving the country could result in persecution or social consequences, such as familial excommunication, can this be seen as evidence that the state's military system operates through coercion rather than genuine consent? I mean, I'm not sure who wants to tackle that. I mean, from what I know, there is conscription in Israel, and if you refuse to join, you will go to prison, and it depends on how long. I think the time limit that they have now, you can't go to prison for longer than a month, and then that just keeps, you go in and out. And I think the longest they can keep you is 3 months. And so there is a price to pay. However, in Israel's conscription, or the IDF starts to enter into the classrooms in Israel in kindergarten. So that's when you're first introduced to the IDF in the school system. So they get you ready so that when you get to the point of being 16 or 17, you just see that as being part of your responsibility as a citizen in Israel. So, and also it's male and men and women are conscripted. It's not just men who have to serve in the IDF. Go ahead. Somebody want to talk about that?
Well, so I'm putting my refugee lawyer hat on again,
Yeah.
and imagining that as a refugee lawyer, I'm representing this young man in a claim for refugee status in Canada, and they're having to push back against allegations that they. Not that this would probably play out this way with respect to an Israeli case, but that the Canadian government lawyers, et cetera, would be saying, well, how could you have been involved in such a horrific military as the Israeli Defense Forces, et cetera, all the horrific human rights violations they've committed, and the various defenses that you would offer. And I actually do remember, 25 years ago, it wasn't Israel, it was another country, but I did have a case of a deserter from a foreign military, and there was Canadian government arguments that they should be excluded from refugee status because they had been in the military for, I think, about a year or so, and we certainly did. Include this kind of evidence, the social ostracization. In that particular case, the young man came from a military family, and so there was even sort of a stronger opprobrium from the family for this, and he did get refugee status in the end, that young man. And that aspect of all of these social aspects, beyond you were afraid they'd beat you up, they were afraid you would be thrown in jail. was given quite a bit of attention. So I think it's an interesting point to raise.
Yeah, we're seeing that play out a little bit here in Canada, even with Iranian men who were made to serve in the IRGC after Canada declared the IRGC a terrorist organization. Many of them are not being allowed to go into the United States, and many of them are being questioned here in Canada. There's a question about writing letters on behalf of those on death row and whether they have any effect on the regime's decision to execute or not. I'm assuming this is an Iranian, the Iranian regime. Mahmoud, do you want to take on that question? I know that you've had much experience with letter writing campaigns.
Yes, absolutely. You see, based on the experience of 20 years monitoring death penalty and following people on death row, what I can say is that, well, there are two things. One is that being unknown is a risk by itself. If you're on death row and nobody knows about you, you are in a much bigger danger. So creating awareness about the person, and that could be writing a letter, but so I assume that the question was about writing not open letters, but letter directly to the authorities. You see, if the authorities realize that somebody knows this person, it can also have an impact because it's all about political cost. It is extremely important. In the last 20 years, the few times Iranian authorities have taken a step in the right direction, it has been because of the political cost. And that political cost comes from that they are afraid of backlash or reactions by the international community, by the people. So I think that helps. And if you can manage to get more people to write about that person, and in addition, I would say to write about it also publicly, it helps. I wouldn't say that it can save every single one, but the chances are much bigger that the person is executed if he's on death row and nobody knows about him or her.
And I totally agree with that. I think that was well said. Sort of awareness and visibility is just so crucial. I think the other thing I would throw into the mix is let's not forget that sometimes, in a death penalty case or other human rights instances, we aren't so much maybe focusing on pressure on the country concerned as we are on other countries who we want to be putting influence on that state. So because those other governments, especially if there is a government that has particular influence with the country concerned, maybe they are more receptive to letter writing campaigns than the state that is going to carry out the execution. So I think we always have to keep that broad view of who our range of targets are in a letter writing campaign.
That's very well said, Alex, because I think that I have been a bigger headache for Norwegian government than for Iranian government for some time.
A headache of the best kind.
Yeah.
If I may just add quickly, not about this question, but the previous question that was asked as a conscientious objector myself, I think compulsory military service is a violation of the right to life, especially during wartime. And many of the individuals who have served in the IRGC, despite their will, they are victims of human rights violations. I think that had to be added, and that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really important to point out. I just want to note that in the Q&A also, there's a link to the press release from Amnesty, which was just issued regarding executions in Iran. So if anybody wants to check that out. And please join us again on September 20th for our next session, which is on the Iranian legal system with a specific focus on Islamic law. Thank you very much to all of our attendees and the panelists today.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Dear panelists, you received the link.